The moment the rancher saw those two Apache sisters standing at his gate, he made a decision that would change the entire valley forever. It was the summer of 1882 in the New Mexico Territory. And what Thomas Barrett did that scorching evening would echo through generations, though nobody could have predicted the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. Thomas Barrett had been working his ranch alone for 40 years. The sun-baked land had taken everything from him, his wife to illness, his daughter to fever, and nearly his will to continue. But that evening, as the desert sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, two figures appeared on the horizon that would test everything he believed about enemies, friendship, and the price of survival. The sisters approached slowly, on foot, their horses nowhere to be seen. Thomas reached for his rifle instinctively. In these lands, Apache meant danger, meant death, meant the loss of everything a man had built. But something in their gait made him pause. These weren't warriors on a raid. Their traditional Apache dress was torn and dust-covered, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something else, desperation mixed with a strange kind of hope. The older sister, who would later reveal her name as Maria, appeared to be no more than 25. Her younger sister Rosa, barely 18, stayed behind her, silent as a shadow. When Maria spoke in broken English, her words sent a chill through Thomas that had nothing to do with the evening breeze sweeping across the desert. Their entire tribe had been wiped out by disease, she explained. Only she and Rosa had survived, and now they were trapped between two worlds, unwelcome among their own scattered people, and marked for death in the white settlements. But what happened next stunned everyone who would later hear this tale. Maria reached into a leather pouch at her side and withdrew something that made Thomas's hands tremble. It was a collection of stones and roots, seemingly ordinary, but Maria claimed they held the secret to finding water, the one thing more valuable than gold in this drought-stricken land. She offered to share this ancient Apache knowledge in exchange for shelter and food, nothing more. Thomas knew the moment he made his choice that his neighbors would brand him a traitor. Jake Sullivan, whose ranch lay 3 miles to the east, had lost his wife and son in an Apache raid just 2 winters past. The entire valley had spent years fighting, bleeding, and dying in conflicts with the Apache. To take in 2 Apache women would be seen as the ultimate betrayal. Yet something in Maria's eyes reminded Thomas of his own daughter's final days, that same mixture of strength and vulnerability, pride and desperation. As he led them to the empty room above the barn that night, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Rosa, who hadn't spoken a single word, carried a necklace that Thomas recognized from his years in these lands. It was a ceremonial piece, the kind worn only by the families of Apache chiefs. These weren't just any refugees. They were connected to Apache royalty, which meant their presence here carried dangers Thomas couldn't yet imagine. The next morning arrived with a tension that seemed to hang in the very air. Before the sun had fully risen, Maria was already at work. Thomas found her on the hill behind the barn, her hands pressed against the earth, her eyes closed in concentration. When she opened them and smiled, she pointed to a spot 20 feet from where they stood. "Water?" she said. "Clean, abundant water, flowing underground like a hidden river." Thomas had worked this land for 4 decades. Teams of men with divining rods had walked every inch of his property. All had declared it hopelessly dry. Yet Maria insisted, and something in her certainty made Thomas grab his shovel. As he began to dig where she indicated, Maria shared something that changed everything Thomas thought he knew about this valley. The Apache, she explained, had lived in these lands for countless generations before the Spanish arrived, before the Americans, before any of the current settlers. They knew secrets buried deeper than any well stories of why certain lands flourished, while others withered, knowledge of underground rivers that followed paths no white surveyor had ever mapped. But more than that, Maria revealed that this particular valley had been sacred to her people for a reason that would soon become terrifyingly clear. By noon, Thomas's shovel hit moisture. By evening, water was pooling in the hole. Word spread through the valley like wildfire. Thomas Barrett had found water in the deadest part of his land. But when neighbors arrived to investigate and saw Maria and Rosa, the celebration turned to shock, then anger. Jake Sullivan arrived with 3 other ranchers. their faces dark with rage. Jake's hand rested on his pistol, as he demanded to know if Thomas had lost his mind. These were Apache, he spat, the same people who had murdered their families, burned their homes, stolen their livestock. How dare Thomas shelter them? How dare he betray everything the valley had fought for? Thomas stood between the angry men and the two sisters, his own hand steady on his rifle. But it was Maria who stepped forward. And what she said next left everyone speechless. She spoke in perfect English, a revelation that stunned even Thomas. She had hidden her fluency to protect herself and Rosa, but now, facing death, she revealed the truth. Maria told them about the disease that had swept through their tribe, a disease brought by white traders. She described watching her mother, father, brothers and cousins die one by one, their bodies burning with fever. She spoke of the choice she and Rosa faced: stay and die with their people, or flee and try to survive in a world that hated them. Her words carried such pain, such humanity, that even Jake Sullivan's hand moved away from his gun. But the most shocking part was still to come. Maria revealed that her father had been the tribe's keeper of stories, the one who held the ancient knowledge of the land. Before he died, he had passed this knowledge to her, believing that one day it might save not just Apache lives, but all lives in the valley. The drought, she explained, wasn't random. It followed patterns the Apache had observed for centuries, and if the settlers continued to ignore these patterns, the entire valley would become a desert within 5 years. Rosa finally spoke then, her voice soft but clear. She had been silent not from fear but from grief, so profound it had stolen her words. She told them about the last days of their tribe, about children dying of thirst, about warriors too weak to hunt. She spoke of their grandmother, the tribe's spiritual leader, who had sent them to find Thomas Barrett specifically. The old woman had dreamed of him, Rosa said, had seen him in visions, as the one white man who might listen, who might understand. This revelation sent a chill through everyone present. How could a dying Apache woman have known Thomas's name? How could she have directed her granddaughters to his specific ranch? The questions hung in the air like dust after a windstorm. Impossible to answer yet impossible to ignore. Jake Sullivan, his face twisted with conflict, asked the question everyone was thinking: why should they trust these women? How did they know this wasn't some elaborate Apache trick? It was then that Maria made an offer that would change the valley forever. She would teach them all, every rancher, every farmer, the Apache methods of finding and preserving water. She would show them how to read the land's signs, how to plant in harmony with the desert's rhythms, how to survive the coming droughts. All she asked in return was that she and Rosa be allowed to live in peace. The debate that followed was fierce. Some ranchers wanted to drive the sisters out immediately. Others, desperate from the drought, wanted to hear more. Thomas found himself at the center of a conflict that threatened to tear the valley apart. But as they argued, something extraordinary happened. Rosa walked to Jake Sullivan's horse, which had been limping from a thorn in its hoof that Jake hadn't been able to find. Without a word, she knelt, ran her hands along the animal's leg, and extracted a deeply embedded thorn that had been causing the animal pain for days. It was a small gesture, but it shifted something in Jake's eyes. He looked at Rosa, really looked at her, and saw not an Apache enemy, but a young woman with gentle hands and knowledge that could help. The anger in his face cracked, revealing the grief beneath grief that had turned to hatred because hatred was easier to bear than pain. That night, Thomas made a decision that shocked everyone, including himself. He announced that Maria and Rosa would stay on his ranch as equals, not servants. They would share meals at his table, sleep in his house, and be treated with the same respect as any other human being. If anyone had a problem with that, they could take it up with him personally. The reaction was explosive. Half the valley supported Thomas, desperate enough from the drought to accept help from anyone. The other half threatened to boycott his ranch, to drive him out along with the Apache sisters. The conflict escalated when the town's preacher arrived, declaring that Thomas was consorting with heathens and endangering his immortal soul. But Maria had one more surprise that silenced even the preacher. She produced a small, worn Bible from her belongings written in Spanish and given to her grandmother by missionaries years before. Maria could quote scripture, had been baptized as a child, and knew more about Christianity than many of the settlers. The preacher stood speechless as this Apache woman corrected his Latin pronunciation and referenced theological points he had never considered. As days turned into weeks, extraordinary things began happening at Thomas's ranch. The well Maria had located produced water so pure and abundant that Thomas's crops began to flourish even in the drought. More mysteriously, his cattle grew healthier, his horses stronger. Other ranchers, watching their own livestock suffer, began to secretly visit, asking for Maria's help. Maria taught them things that seemed like magic, but were simply deep observation passed down through generations. She showed them how certain insects predicted rain, how the behavior of underground creatures indicated water sources, how the growth patterns of desert plants revealed invisible rivers below. Rosa, meanwhile, proved to be a gifted healer, using traditional remedies to cure ailments that had plagued the settlers for years. But not everyone was convinced. A group of hardline ranchers, led by a newcomer named Samuel Hayes, began spreading rumors that the sisters were witches, that they were poisoning the water supply, that they were secretly communicating with hostile Apache bands planning an attack. The accusations grew wilder and more dangerous with each passing day. Everything came to a head when Jake Sullivan's daughter fell desperately ill with a fever the local doctor couldn't cure. Jake, desperate and with nowhere else to turn, brought the child to Rosa in the middle of the night. Rosa worked through till dawn, using herbal remedies and cooling techniques the settlers had never seen. By morning, the fever had broken, and the child was recovering. Jake's public acknowledgement of Rosa saving his daughter's life marked a turning point. He stood in the town square and declared that he had been wrong, that his hatred had blinded him to the truth. These women weren't enemies, they were neighbors, they were human beings, and they had saved his daughter when his own people's medicine had failed. But Samuel Hayes wasn't finished. He had lost family to Apache raids years before, and couldn't let go of his need for revenge. He gathered a group of like-minded men and rode to Thomas's ranch one night, intending to force the sisters out or worse. What they found when they arrived shocked them to their core. The ranch was surrounded by Apache warriors, at least 20 of them, painted for war and armed with rifles. But these warriors weren't there to attack. They had come to check on Maria and Rosa, having heard rumors of their presence in the valley. The chief who led them was Rosa and Maria's uncle, and he had been searching for them for months. The confrontation that followed balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the valley would erupt in bloodshed. But Maria stepped between the two groups and spoke in rapid Apache to her uncle, then turned to address the settlers in English. She translated back and forth, her words preventing what could have been a massacre. Her uncle revealed something that stunned everyone present. The Apache hadn't been raiding the valley for sport or cruelty. They had been desperately trying to prevent the settlers from damming certain streams, from disrupting water flows that were crucial not just for Apache survival but for the entire region's ecological balance. Every raid, every attack had been an attempt to protect water sources that the settlers were unknowingly destroying. This revelation reframed years of conflict. The Apache hadn't been savage enemies but desperate people watching their land die, trying to prevent a catastrophe that would affect everyone. Maria's uncle offered a proposal, a treaty, not with the government but with the people of the valley themselves. Share the knowledge, share the water, share the land, and all could survive. Fight, and all would perish in the coming droughts. Thomas Barrett became the unlikely mediator of negotiations that would reshape the territory. With Maria translating and Rosa tending to the sick and wounded on both sides, slowly, painfully, peace began to take shape. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when violence nearly erupted, old grievances that seemed impossible to overcome. But something miraculous was happening. As Apache and settlers worked together to dig new wells using the combined knowledge of both peoples, as they shared meals and stories, as children began to play together despite their parents' initial horror, the valley began to transform. The drought didn't end, but its effects lessened. Crops grew where only dust had been. Streams that had been dry for years began to flow again. Maria revealed more of her father's knowledge, how the Apache had practiced controlled burns to prevent the devastating wildfires that plagued the region, how they had cultivated certain plants that held moisture in the soil, how they had lived in balance with the land for centuries before the disruption began. The settlers, in turn, shared their own innovations, tools and techniques that, combined with Apache knowledge, created something entirely new. Rosa fell in love with the doctor's son, a young man who had initially protested her presence but had been won over by her compassion and skill. Their courtship scandalized both communities but also symbolized the possibility of a different future. When they married in a ceremony that combined Apache and Christian traditions, the entire valley attended, even those who had sworn never to accept the sisters. But the greatest test came when a group of army soldiers arrived. Having heard reports of Apache living freely among settlers, they demanded the sisters be turned over for relocation to a reservation. The officer in charge, Colonel Morrison, was known for his harsh treatment of Apache prisoners and his belief that the only good Indian was a dead one. What happened next became legend in the valley. Every single settler, including Samuel Hayes, who had led the opposition to the sisters, stood with Thomas Barrett in refusing to turn over Maria and Rosa. Jake Sullivan, the man who had lost his family to Apache raids, stood nose to nose with Colonel Morrison and told him that these women were citizens of the valley, under the protection of every gun in the territory. The standoff lasted 3 days. The army threatened legal action, threatened to arrest everyone for harboring fugitives, but the valley held firm. Even the preacher, who had initially condemned Thomas, now preached about the Good Samaritan and the Christian duty to protect the innocent. The solidarity was absolute. Apache and settler standing together against outside force. Colonel Morrison, faced with the prospect of fighting an entire valley of armed citizens, ultimately withdrew, but not before warning that this peace between Apache and settlers went against everything the government was trying to achieve. The valley, he declared, was in rebellion against the natural order of things. Maria's response to this became famous throughout the territory. The natural order, she said, wasn't white against Apache, or Apache against white. The natural order was human beings working together to survive in a harsh land, sharing knowledge instead of bullets, building instead of destroying. The rebellion wasn't against nature, it was against the unnatural hatred that had been cultivated for profit and power. As seasons passed, the valley became known as a miracle in the desert. While surrounding regions suffered from drought and conflict, this small corner of New Mexico thrived. Delegations came from other territories to learn the water-finding techniques. Agricultural experts from universities back east arrived to study the innovative farming methods that combined Apache tradition with modern techniques. Maria wrote down the knowledge her father had passed to her, creating a document that would be studied for generations. But she wrote it in both Apache and English, insisting that both languages, both peoples, were necessary to understand the full truth. Rosa established a healing center where she taught both traditional Apache medicine and modern techniques to anyone willing to learn. The transformation wasn't without cost. Some settlers left, unable to accept the new reality. Some Apache refused to forgive past grievances. There were fights, setbacks, moments when the fragile peace nearly shattered. But each time, the memory of what they had achieved together pulled them back from the brink. Thomas Barrett, the lonely rancher who had made a desperate choice one evening, found his ranch becoming the unofficial capital of this new community. His dinner table, where Maria and Rosa had first sat as equals, became the site of council meetings where Apache and settler leaders made decisions together. His barn became a school where children of both peoples learned each other's languages and customs. The story might have ended there, a local tale of reconciliation in a violent time, but then something happened that thrust the valley into national attention. A massive drought struck the entire Southwest, the worst in recorded history. Settlements from Texas to California withered and died. Cattle perished by the thousands. Entire towns were abandoned. But the valley survived, using the techniques Maria had taught them, the water management systems they had developed together, the agricultural practices that merged Apache wisdom, With settler innovation, they not only survived but had enough surplus to help neighboring regions. The valley became a lifeline, sharing water and food with desperate communities throughout the territory. Newspapers from San Francisco to New York carried the story. How could one small valley thrive when entire states were suffering? Investigators arrived expecting to find some hidden river or secret reservoir. Instead, they found something far more remarkable. A community that had chosen cooperation over conflict, that had recognized the humanity in their supposed enemies, that had merged different knowledge systems to create something stronger than either alone. The government, embarrassed by the valley's success while their own policies led to disaster elsewhere, tried to claim credit. Officials arrived to study and replicate what had been achieved. But without the human element, the trust built through shared struggle, the respect earned through mutual recognition, the techniques alone weren't enough. Other places tried to copy the water-finding methods but failed because they lacked the deeper understanding that came from true cultural exchange. Maria and Rosa became symbols of a different possibility for the American West. They traveled to other communities, teaching not just the technical knowledge, but the harder lessons of how to see past prejudice, how to value different ways of knowing, how to build trust where only hatred had existed. They faced resistance, sometimes violent, but also found eager audiences tired of endless conflict. The sisters' story inspired other Apache to reach out to sympathetic settlers. Other settlers to question the violence they had been told was inevitable. Small pockets of cooperation began to spring up across the territories, each one a seed of possibility in a landscape of conflict. Not all succeeded. The forces pushing for separation and violence were strong, but some did, creating islands of peace in a sea of strife. Back in the valley, life continued to evolve. Rosa's children grew up speaking both Apache and English, equally comfortable in both worlds. Maria, who never married, became the valley's unofficial historian and teacher, ensuring that the knowledge of both peoples would be preserved for future generations. She established a library where Apache oral traditions were recorded alongside settler journals, creating an archive of survival in the desert. Thomas Barrett lived to see his transformed ranch become a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand how peace had been achieved. In his final years, he often sat on his porch with Maria and Rosa, watching the sun set over fields that had once been barren but now bloomed with life. He would tell visitors that the greatest discovery hadn't been water but the recognition that survival required not conquest but cooperation. The preacher who had once condemned Thomas for consorting with heathens now preached that God worked through all people, that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, that the Bible's command to love thy neighbor didn't come with exceptions for Apache or any other people. His sermons, published in religious newspapers, sparked theological debates about the nature of salvation and the universality of human dignity. Jake Sullivan, the man who had lost everything to Apache raids, became one of the strongest advocates for the new way. He would tell anyone who listened that revenge had nearly destroyed him, that hatred had been a poison more deadly than any drought. Saving his daughter had saved more than her life. It had saved his soul from the darkness of perpetual rage. When the federal government finally sent negotiators to establish an official reservation in the area, they found something unprecedented. The Apache refused to be segregated onto a reservation, and the settlers refused to let them be taken. The negotiators faced a united front that defied every expectation, every policy, every assumption about racial separation in the American West. The compromise that emerged created a new kind of legal entity. Not quite a reservation, not quite a standard township, but something unique. The valley became a self-governing territory where Apache and settler law merged, where both peoples had equal say in governance, where the water rights Maria had helped establish were protected by federal treaty. It wasn't perfect, no human institution ever is, but it was revolutionary. Years later, historians would debate whether the valley's success could have been replicated elsewhere. Some argued it was a unique combination of desperate circumstances, remarkable individuals, and fortunate timing. Others believed it proved that the violent conquest of the West wasn't inevitable, that other choices had always been possible if people had been willing to make them. But for those who lived through it, The debates were less important than the daily reality of survival and growth. Children grew up thinking it was normal for Apache and settler families to share Sunday dinners, for water-finding ceremonies to combine indigenous knowledge with modern geology, for town meetings to be conducted in both languages. What had seemed impossible to their parents became ordinary to them. The story of the two Apache sisters who transformed a valley spread far beyond the American West. It reached reservation schools where Apache children were being forced to forget their culture, inspiring secret efforts to preserve traditional knowledge. It reached eastern cities where reformers were arguing about the Indian problem, offering a different model than either forced assimilation or violent suppression. Maria kept a journal through all of this, written in both Apache and English, documenting not just the technical knowledge but the human journey. Her entries revealed the private struggles behind public successes, the nights she and Rosa cried for their lost family, the moments they wanted to flee the hostility, the times they questioned whether peace was possible. But also the small victories, a child's smile crossing cultural boundaries, a shared meal ending in laughter, a problem solved through combined wisdom. The journal's most powerful entry came near the end of Maria's life. She wrote about watching an Apache girl and a settler boy working together to dig a new well, using techniques both peoples had contributed. They worked in easy harmony, occasionally arguing about the best approach but never questioning each other's basic humanity. This, Maria wrote, was the true water they had found. Not just the liquid that sustained physical life, but the flow of understanding that sustained community. When Hollywood eventually tried to make a movie about the valley, they got it all wrong. They wanted a simple story of good versus evil, of heroic settlers or noble savages. They couldn't capture the messy, difficult, beautiful reality of people choosing to see each other as human despite every reason not to. The Valley refused to cooperate with the filming, protecting their story from simplification and exploitation. But the truth continued to spread in other ways. Agricultural colleges sent students to study the integrated farming techniques. Anthropologists came to document the cultural fusion that had emerged. Theologians examined how Christian and Apache spirituality had found common ground. Each group found what they expected to find, but the full truth remained larger than any single perspective could capture. The descendants of those original valley residents still live there today, still practicing the water-finding techniques Maria taught, still maintaining the bilingual governance structure, still gathering for the annual celebration that marks the day Thomas Barrett made his choice. They faced new challenges: industrial agriculture trying to buy up water rights, developers wanting to build resorts, historians trying to romanticize or politicize their story. But the foundation built by two desperate sisters and one lonely rancher has proven strong enough to endure. The most remarkable thing about the story isn't that it happened, but that it almost didn't. If Thomas had turned the sisters away that night, if Jake's hatred had won over his desperation, if Maria hadn't possessed her father's knowledge, if Rosa hadn't saved that child, if any of 1,000 moments had gone differently, the valley would have died in the drought like so many others. Peace balanced on such small hinges, such fragile human choices. In the end, what the two Apache sisters gave the valley wasn't just water. They gave the possibility of a different story. One where survival came through cooperation rather than conquest, where different ways of knowing strengthened rather than threatened each other, where the courage to see common humanity in the face of the enemy created miracles in the desert. They proved that even in the harshest landscapes, both physical and social, life finds a way when people choose to help it flow rather than dam it up with hatred. The water still flows in that valley, drawn up from depths that only Apache knowledge could find, distributed through systems that settler engineering made efficient, nurturing crops that combine both traditions. But more importantly, understanding flows too. The recognition that survival in a harsh world requires not the victory of one people over another, but the victory of all people over the forces that would divide them. That was the true gift of the Desert Sisters, and it flows still, an underground river of hope in a landscape too often parched by hatred.